The ocean was on fire. Black columns of smoke twisted into the pale spring sky, blotting out the sun over Okinawa. On the flight deck of the USS Bunker Hill, men ran through rivers of burning fuel, their silhouettes flickering against waves of flame. Somewhere beneath the roar, a sailor screamed for water that would never come. Then, a second plane appeared, a Silver Zero, diving straight through the smoke like a blade through cloth. The crew barely had time to look up before the world went white. I was there, or so I've told myself, every day since reading the letters of Ensign Koshi Ogawa, the young Japanese pilot who guided that Zero into our ship. We down below found hell instead. We thought we understood. Our carriers were the floating fortresses of a new empire. Our decks wide enough to launch the thunder that would end wars. The British called their carriers armored boxes. We called ours cities of offense. Both believed we had built perfection. Both were wrong. Because that morning in May 1945, two worlds collided. Not armies, not ideologies, but two philosophies of survival. One born in the confined seas of Europe, hardened by endurance. The other forged in the endless expanse of the Pacific, built for overwhelming strike. And in a single burning hour, both would be tested by a weapon no blueprint had foreseen, a human-guided missile powered by faith, desperation, and death. What happened next would shatter every illusion of invincibility and rewrite the future of naval warfare forever. The battle for the Pacific wasn't just a war of nations, it was a collision of ideas. From the burning decks of Okinawa to the quiet shipyards of Norfolk and Belfast, two different philosophies had taken shape long before the first bombs fell. Both were forged by fear, pride, and necessity. Both promised victory, yet each carried within it the seed of its own downfall. The Americans built to strike first and end the fight fast. Their carriers were temples of momentum, massive open-breathing machines of steel and fire. The Essex class was not a fortress, it was a weapon. Everything about her screamed aggression. Her wooden flight deck was light, flexible, and quick to repair. Her hangar bays were open to the wind, letting mechanics warm engines before dawn. Launches her elevators designed to lift squadrons into the air in minutes. Below, cavernous tanks of aviation fuel and magazines of bombs pulsed like a living heart. She could launch 100 planes in a single blow, and when they returned, if they returned, she could strike again before the enemy even found her position. America's advantage was scale, speed, and relentless pressure. The Pacific was vast, and they had built ships that could cross it faster than anyone in history. Across the ocean in the gray shipyards of Britain, another doctrine had taken root, one born not from ambition, but survival. British carriers were not designed to win wars in a day. They were designed to endure them. The Royal Navy's illustrious class was smaller, heavier, slower. Its deck wasn't wood, it was armor, 3 inches of hardened steel forming the very spine of the ship. Beneath it, every essential system was wrapped in another layer of armor, like a heart encased in bone. The hangar decks were sealed, self-contained, their ammunition and fuel hidden behind armored walls. Each ship was a floating bunker, meant to take a direct hit and stay afloat. That design was born in the narrow seas of Europe, where German bombers ruled the sky, and survival was measured in minutes. The Royal Navy had learned its lessons in the Mediterranean, where a single bomb could decide a campaign, and rescue was never guaranteed. British naval architects understood that they couldn't match American production, so they built for endurance, not abundance. Their carriers carried fewer aircraft, perhaps half the number of an Essex, but each plane had a better chance of returning to a ship still floating. Their doctrine was simple: fight close, survive the first strike, strike back tomorrow. On paper, both designs seemed to serve their masters perfectly. America's carriers embodied a nation of limitless industry and energy ships that could be built by the dozen and replaced in months. Britain's carriers reflected a nation under siege, fighting with what it had, turning defense into art. One prioritized offensive tempo, the other survivability. One chased supremacy through firepower, the other through resilience. And yet beneath the surface, the two philosophies carried an unspoken arrogance. The Americans believed their air power could end any threat before it touched them. The British believed no weapon could break through their armor. Both were right until reality changed. The contrast between the two fleets was more than metal. It was cultural. American optimism versus British pragmatism. The Essex class was a promise that no battle needed to last long. The illustrious class was a confession that some would last forever. American crews trained to move like lightning, launch strike, recover, repeat. British crews trained to fight fires, seal bulkheads, and repair under bombardment. Each side looked at the other and saw weakness. The Americans saw slowness, the British saw recklessness. Both were preparing for a war they believed they understood. By early 1945, the philosophies stood side by side off Okinawa. Task Force 58 and Task Force 57, two fleets, united by purpose, but divided by design. Their decks reflected two visions of the future, one made of wood and speed, the other of steel and endurance. For a moment, it seemed both could coexist, each covering the other's flaws. But war has a way of finding those flaws and driving a knife straight through them. Because even the best doctrines, the most perfect machines are built for the wars, men imagine not the ones they actually fight. No one in those fleets knew that a new kind of weapon was already on its way, born not of strategy or engineering, but of desperation. A weapon that made armor meaningless and speed irrelevant. It did not fly to live or return. It did not obey physics, mercy, or fear. The Japanese called it Shinpu, the divine wind. To the Allies, it would soon have another name, Kamikaze. And when it came screaming out of the clouds, it would tear through both philosophies at once, proving that even the most brilliant human designs can crumble before the madness of men who refuse to lose. Because war in the end never obeys theory. It devours it. No war invention was ever born from comfort. Every new weapon, every new doctrine, came from fear, fear of losing, of fading into the footnotes of history. And by the spring of 1945, Japan had nothing left to lose. The empire that once roared across Asia now bled from every direction. Its navy was shattered, its airfields bombed, to dust its cities burning under American firestorms. Factories lay silent, their machines buried under rubble. The skies that once belonged to the rising sun were ruled by American hellcats and corsairs. Yet in that ruin, something darker began to take shape, an idea so desperate, so absolute, that it would terrify even the men who created it. The Japanese called it Shinpu Tokubetsu Kogekitai, the Divine Wind Special Attack Units. The West would come to know the word that froze sailors' blood across the Pacific, Kamikaze. It began as a whisper among officers who could no longer pretend victory was possible. Vice Admiral Takajiro Onishi, a man of intelligence and quiet despair, gave the madness a name and form. He proposed the unthinkable, that pilots should turn themselves into weapons, not as a metaphor, literally. They would take off, not to fight, not to return, but to die. Their planes, Zeros stripped of guns and loaded with a single 550-pound bomb, would dive into Allied ships with the precision no machine could match. A human-guided missile, powered by devotion and fatalism. It wasn't strategy anymore. It was sacrifice, industrialized. Onishi's logic was brutal and chillingly clear. Japan could no longer replace its pilots or aircraft. Every conventional sortie ended in slaughter. The only way to hurt the Americans was to ensure every plane hit its target, no matter the cost. One plane, one ship. A perfect equation of despair. And beneath that cold arithmetic lay something far more dangerous: faith. The Kamikaze was not sold to its pilots as suicide. It was framed as transcendence, a return to the samurai code that glorified self-destruction in service of the emperor. The word Shinpu itself was a revival of myth, the divine wind said to have saved Japan from Mongol invasion 7 centuries earlier. The message was clear. Japan had been chosen by destiny to repel another foreign invader, and the weapon would not be steel or fire, but purity. Recruits came willingly. Many were university students, poets, sons of farmers, who still believed their emperor was a living god. They wrote letters home filled with serenity, as if walking toward death was an honor rather than a horror. "I will fly calmly," one wrote as if over a peaceful sea. Behind that calm was indoctrination polished to perfection, a nation's grief turned into a blade. Yet for all the ceremony and conviction, the kamikaze was a weapon born of complete collapse. It was not a symbol of strength, it was the last refuge of a dying empire. The military dressed it in ritual, but its origin was pure panic. Every kamikaze unit was an admission that Japan's industry had failed, that its pilots were too few, its airframes too fragile, its hope already gone. It was faith replacing fuel, conviction replacing strategy. Still, in the first days, it worked. Off Leyte Gulf, in October 1944, the world saw the first divine winds descend. 5 pilots dove from the sky and slammed into American escort carriers. One struck the USS Street low. The explosion ripped her apart. Within minutes, she was gone. For the first time, a new terror entered Allied minds, not the fear of being outgunned, but of facing an enemy who wanted to die. The effect was psychological as much as tactical. How do you defend against someone who considers death a victory? Every radar blip, every shadow in the clouds became a heartbeat of dread. Ships fired thousands of rounds into empty air. Pilots flying combat air patrols found themselves haunted by the idea that even one missed target could mean the death of hundreds of men below. The Allies adapted, but the dread never left. And Japan, seeing that terror bloom, doubled down. What began as a handful of missions turned into organized waves. Kikasui, the floating chrysanthemum attacks. Thousands of young men volunteered. Hundreds never even reached their target, shot down before they saw the fleet. But enough did. Enough to make every sailor flinch at the distant whine of an engine. As Japan's desperation deepened, the weapon itself evolved. Engineers built the Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, a small rocket-powered glider with a massive warhead and a pilot locked inside. It was launched beneath lumbering Betty bombers that almost never survived the approach. The Americans nicknamed it the Baka bomb, the idiot bomb. But there was nothing idiotic about it. At speeds over 500 miles per hour, the Oka could turn an aircraft carrier into a funeral pyre. This was the nightmare the architects of the Essex and Illustrious classes had never accounted for. Their theories had been built on the logic of men who wanted to live, pilots who would pull away at the last moment, gunners who fought to survive. But the kamikaze turned every calculation inside out. Armor meant little when the pilot aimed directly for the bridge. Open hangars became chimneys of fire. The speed that once promised safety now made it impossible to evade. It was as if war itself had gone insane. Strategy gave way to ritual. Tactics became theology. And yet there was a terrible brilliance in it. The kamikaze took the cold precision of modern war and infected it with human passion, the kind that logic cannot fight. It forced the Allies to confront a truth they had forgotten, that courage, even twisted and blind, can still wound the unstoppable. But the cost was unimaginable. For every ship hit, 10 pilots burned in the sky before impact. Japan's airfields emptied. Its youth vanished into clouds of smoke. The divine wind, meant to save the nation, consumed it instead. Still, for those few months in 1945, it changed everything. Admirals rewrote their doctrines overnight. Damage control teams drilled without rest. Sailors slept beside hoses and ammunition belts. On every carrier, the question echoed, could any ship, any design, truly survive a weapon that used human conviction as its fuel? No fleet was ready for the answer. Because this new enemy did not rise from the sea or radar screens, it came from belief itself. From the skies above Okinawa, from the hearts of men who mistook sacrifice for salvation, came a force no armor could deflect. From the sky, from the sea, and from within the human soul itself, the challenger had arrived. And it was unlike anything mankind had ever faced. The morning of May 4th, 1945 broke gray and silent over the Ryukyu Islands. The sea was calm, deceptively calm, the kind of stillness that always came before disaster. Above it hung a curtain of cloud, and behind that cloud death waited. The men of Task Force 57, the The British Pacific Fleet stood at their stations, eyes scanning the horizon. On the deck of HMS Formidable, the smell of aviation fuel mixed with salt and tension. They had heard the stories the kamikaze raids tearing through the American fleets to the east. No one said it aloud, but every man knew their turn would come. It came at 1130 a.m. A single speck appeared on the radar screen, then vanished into static. Seconds later, the lookout shouted, "Bandit bearing 080. The alarm howled. Gunners spun their turrets skyward. Out of the clouds burst a Zero streaking low over the water, its engine screaming like a furious ghost. Tracer rounds arced toward it, white sparks against gray, but the pilot didn't flinch. The plane climbed dipped, then plunged straight into the flight deck, just beside the island tower. The impact was like a thunderclap. Steel groaned. The deck rippled underfoot. For an instant, silence. Then came the roar. The bomb's detonation tore a crater 2 feet deep into the armored deck, scattering molten metal and debris across the bow. Flames burst from ruptured fuel lines. Men were thrown to the deck, some vanishing into the firestorm before they could scream. Yet the armor held. The blast did not pierce through. Below deck, the hangar stayed sealed, its thick walls containing the inferno above. Damage control teams, some barely conscious, rushed into the smoke, dragging hoses, sealing doors, choking on soot. 20 minutes later, the fires were dying. Within 6 hours, the crater was patched with steel plates, and HMS Formidable was launching aircraft again. Her deck was scarred, but her heart still beat. To the men aboard, it felt like defying death itself. They had seen what these attacks could do to the Americans, how a single kamikaze could cripple a ship for months. Yet here they stood, alive engines, roaring planes, lifting off into the same sky that had tried to kill them. There was pride, yes, but also awe, a silent respect for the madness they had just survived. But war never gives the same mercy twice. 5 days later, on May 9th, as the Formidable continued airstrikes over the Sakishima Islands, another Zero slipped through the cloud barrier. This time, the ship's guns found their mark too late. The aircraft struck the aft deck with a deafening crack. The explosion depressed the armored deck by 4 inches, but once again failed to penetrate. Burning fuel spilled across the steel, hissing and clawing at the edges of the crater. The crew fought the flames like seasoned firefighters, hoses, hissing boots melting against the heat. The sprinkler system activated automatically, dousing the inferno. In 15 minutes it was over, 1 man dead, 7 planes destroyed. The ship was operational within the hour. It was brutal mechanical resilience, the triumph of engineering and discipline. The Formidable had been hit twice, and twice she refused to die. Among the crew, a saying spread like wildfire. When a kamikaze hits an American carrier, she heads to Pearl. When it hits a British carrier, the sweepers grab their brooms. It was half joke, half prophecy. They didn't know how true it would soon become. Because just 2 days later, east of Okinawa Task Force 58, the American fast carriers faced the storm head-on. On the morning of May 11th, the USS Bunker Hill had already been at war for 58 days without rest. Her decks were lined with aircraft fully fueled and armed, ready for the next strike. Below, hundreds of men were eating breakfast, writing letters, or praying for a day without alarms. The sky was bright, deceptively peaceful. Then, at 10:04 a.m., 2 dots appeared on the radar. Seconds later, the first kamikaze broke through the cloud. Sub-Lieutenant Seizo Yasunori came in fast and low, his Zero trailing smoke, but steady. Anti-aircraft guns opened up the sky, turned white with tracers, but he didn't waver. His 550-pound bomb pierced through the wooden deck, through the ready rooms below, and exploded as it exited the starboard side. The blast tore the flight deck open like paper. The plane itself slammed into a cluster of fueled aircraft, setting off a chain of fireballs that consumed the entire aft section. Men disappeared in a single breath. Within seconds, the air above the ship glowed orange. 30 seconds later, the second plane came. Ensign Koshi Ogawa dove through the flames, his Zero a comet of death. His bomb punched through the flight deck and detonated deep inside the ship, right in the pilot's ready rooms. 22 men died instantly vaporized where Saturday Ogawa's plane smashed into the island tower, killing 14 officers, nearly taking Admiral Mark Mitcher with it. What followed was not a fire, it was an apocalypse. The Bunker Hill's open hangar design, once praised for ventilation and speed, became a furnace. Flames raced through the decks, fed by rivers of aviation fuel. Bombs cooked off one by one. The sound was deafening, a rolling thunder that shook the sea itself. Below in the engineering compartments, men like Lieutenant Commander Joseph Carmichael ordered their crews to stay at their stations, holding the water pressure steady for the fire hoses above. They obeyed, knowing they were sealing their own fate. 125 of them never made it out. On the flight deck, chaos turned to horror. Men stumbled through smoke uniforms aflame, trying to push burning wrecks overboard. Some jumped into the ocean, their bodies vanishing beneath waves slick with fuel. Others stayed to fight, hacking at flaming debris, coughing up soot and blood. The ship turned hard to starboard the maneuver, sending torrents of flaming fuel spilling into the sea. Slowly, agonizingly, the fires began to die. By evening, Bunker Hill was still afloat, but barely. 400 men were dead or missing, hundreds more burned or broken. The smell of charred metal and flesh hung in the air. That night, the longest burial at sea in U.S. naval history, began 8 hours of prayers and silence as 352 sailors were committed to the Pacific. The sea swallowed them gently as if ashamed of what man had made of it. From the distance the scene looked biblical. One ship burning, another sailing on. The formidable, scarred but alive, the Bunker Hill gutted and limping. The contrast could not have been more brutal. The armored deck had proven itself. The open hangar had betrayed its own genius. The philosophies that once looked so perfect now lay in ruins or smoke. When dawn came, the sea was quiet again. The smoke thinned into blue. Both fleets had survived, but neither was the same. Every man who stood on those decks had seen the end of theory, the moment when design met destiny. When the smoke cleared, what remained was more than twisted steel. It was the truth of war itself, that victory is not measured by what you destroy, but by what you can endure. When the fires finally died and the ashes settled over Okinawa, the two fleets stood as mirror images of victory and ruin. The British carriers of Task Force 57, battered, scorched, but still operational, continued launching strikes within hours. The Americans of Task Force 58 mourned hundreds, their flagship crippled and limping back toward home. Both had fought the same enemy, faced the same storm, but the outcomes could not have been more different. The contrast was brutal, mathematical, and deeply human. The armored flight decks of the British had absorbed the unthinkable. They had endured direct hits, burning fuel, exploding bombs, and kept their hearts beating. Their design philosophy, born from years of fighting under the shadow of the Luftwaffe, had proven almost prophetic. Every inch of steel armor, every sealed hangar bay, every decision to trade offensive capacity for protection, now stood vindicated. They had chosen survival over speed, and in the furnace of Okinawa, survival was the only currency that mattered. The Americans had chosen differently. Their Essex-class carriers, masterpieces of industrial might, embodied the belief that war could be won through aggression and efficiency. Their wooden decks allowed faster repairs, their open hangars allowed rapid launches, their sprawling air groups gave them unmatched striking power. Against any conventional enemy, it was a perfect system. But the Kamikaze was not conventional. The Kamikaze didn't obey the old rules of engagement. It turned every strength into a weakness, every advantage into a liability. The very openness that made the Essex so lethal also made her vulnerable. One flaming zero could slip through the screen and the ship would burn from the inside out. It would be easy to say the British design was better, but that would miss the truth entirely. The two fleets had been built for different wars. The Royal Navy had fought in narrow seas under constant threat of land-based bombers, where a single lucky hit could end a campaign. They had to build ships that could take punishment and fight again. The U.S. Navy, by contrast, fought in the limitless Pacific, an ocean where distance killed more ships than enemy guns. Their carriers had to reach thousands of miles, project power fast, recover faster. They didn't need to survive every battle. They needed to end the war before the enemy could strike back. Each philosophy was logical. Each was right until the rules changed. The Kamikaze was the great equalizer. It forced every admiral, every engineer, every strategist to confront a truth that no blueprint could solve, that human desperation can shatter any calculation. The British armored decks didn't make them invincible, they simply bought them time. The American wooden decks didn't make them foolish, they made them lethal in a different kind of war. But at Okinawa, the war wasn't about speed or range anymore. It was about endurance, about which ship could remain afloat long enough to launch one more plane. Behind every design decision lay a moral choice. The Americans had wagered lives on efficiency. The British had wagered victory on caution. Both choices carried a price. The Bunker Hill lost nearly 400 souls in a single morning, but her sisters, like the Essex and Yorktown, had unleashed the air power that brought Japan to its knees. The Formidable and her armored sisters suffered less blood, but carried fewer planes, struck smaller blows, and relied on others to finish the job. The lesson was cruel, but clear. War rewards adaptability, not ideology. And adapt they did. Within months, American naval architects began to redesign. The Midway-class carriers that followed combined the lessons of both philosophies, a vast air group under a fully armored flight deck. Steel where it mattered, space where it was needed. The future of naval warfare would be a synthesis of British caution and American daring. The fire of Okinawa had forged not just survivors, but evolution. Yet even beyond the blueprints, there was a deeper revelation. The Kamikaze had shown that no amount of metal, no brilliance of engineering could fully protect against the chaos of human will. You could build thicker decks, stronger hulls, faster planes, but you could never armor the soul. The pilots who flew into the ships and the sailors who stood on those decks, fighting flames with bare hands, were two faces of the same truth. War is fought not by machines, but by conviction. The Bunker Hill's smoldering carcass became a floating monument to the cost of overconfidence. The Formidable's scarred but steady deck became a symbol of resilience. Between them lay the spectrum of survival, destruction, and endurance, loss, and defiance. Both fleets had proven their worth. Both had bled for it. In the end, the verdict wasn't written in steel, but in time. The British armored philosophy proved essential against suicide tactics, but unsustainable in the long game. Their heavy carriers could not operate with the relentless pace of the American fleet train. The Americans' offensive doctrine, though costly, overwhelmed Japan through sheer mass and momentum. One nation endured through durability, the other triumphed through production. Together they revealed the dual heartbeat of modern warfare: resilience and reach. The fire at Okinawa was more than a battle, it was an examination. It tested every assumption humans had made about technology, courage, and control. It proved that progress is not measured in victories, but in lessons learned from near destruction. For the engineers back home, the message was blunt: never again design in isolation. For the sailors who lived through it, the lesson was harder still. No armor can protect a man from what he must see and remember. By the time Japan surrendered, 3 months later, both navies had changed forever. The age of wooden decks was over. The age of armored aviation had begun. But something else had shifted too. Something that couldn't be drawn on blueprints. In the silence after the fires, the men who had fought on those decks understood that technology could not save them from the consequences of belief. Because in the end, it was belief, faith in design, faith in doctrine, faith in the idea that we could master war that had nearly destroyed them. The Kamikaze had burned that illusion away. The fleets would rebuild. New carriers would rise. The seas would quiet again. But the memory of that burning sky would remain etched into every rivet, every hand that touched steel. Because war, as the men of Okinawa learned, is not measured in the number of ships that sink or survive. It is measured in what humanity learns from the ashes. When the war ended and the guns went silent, the seas that had once boiled with fire turned calm again. But beneath that calm lay ghosts, echoes of the ships that burned the men who fell, and the choices that shaped their fates. The battle off Okinawa was more than the last great clash of the Pacific. It was the final argument between two visions of war, written in steel and sealed in blood. One believed in power, unleashed; the other in endurance, unbroken. Both proved true, and both exacted a price so high that even victory felt hollow. The armored decks of the British had held, and their ships returned to port scarred but afloat. The wooden decks of the Americans had burned, but their fleets had carried the war to its brutal conclusion. Between them, the future of naval warfare was born. The Midway-class carriers that followed would take lessons from both the courage of speed and the wisdom of survival, the reach of American industry and the stubborn endurance of British resolve. From those ashes, a new generation of steel leviathans would rise, floating cities built not merely to fight, but to outlast anything that dared to challenge them. Yet the true legacy of Okinawa was not found in blueprints or victories. It was written in the faces of those who survived. Men who had stood in the heart of infernos, who had watched their friends vanish in seconds and still picked up a hose, a wrench, or a stretcher to keep the ship alive. They learned that war was not a contest of machines but of wills, and that even the strongest steel bends when the soul behind it falters. The Kamikaze, too, left its scar on history not as a weapon, but as a warning. It showed what happens when faith replaces reason, when the human spirit is twisted into a tool for destruction. Those young pilots believed they were saving their homeland. In truth, they became victims of a system that fed on their devotion. Their courage was undeniable, their tragedy immeasurable. They forced the world to confront a terrible question. How far can conviction go before it becomes madness? The men who fought them understood that question in their bones. On every deck where flames once raged, there lingered a silence. Afterward, not the silence of relief, but of reckoning. They had survived, yes, but at a cost that would haunt them for life. When they looked out at the horizon, they no longer saw glory. They saw the reflection of what humanity was capable of, its brilliance and its cruelty, its genius and its blindness. And yet from that reflection came something profound. In the decades that followed, the very nations that had tried to annihilate each other began to rebuild together. British engineers shared their knowledge of armored decks with American designers. Japanese shipyards, once shattered, became builders of peace. The oceans that had once divided empires became the arteries of cooperation. It was as if the sea itself had demanded redemption for all the lives it had taken. Today, when aircraft carriers glide silently across calm waters, their decks armored and their systems guided by precision unseen, in 1945, they carry more than planes. They carry memory. Every layer of steel, every fire suppression system, every reinforced bulkhead is a tribute to those who burned before them. Technology advanced, but the principle remained. Every innovation is paid for in lives, and every lesson is written in smoke. The Battle of Okinawa ended long ago, but its truth endures that progress born from pain carries both wisdom and warning. Humanity builds, destroys, and builds again, forever chasing safety through the tools of war. But no armor, no weapon, no empire will ever make us invincible. The only shield that endures is understanding. And so the legacy of those two fleets drifts across time, quiet but unbroken. The waves that once reflected fire now shimmer with peace, yet beneath their calm lies the heartbeat of everything learned in that terrible spring. Because when the flames finally die and the ocean grows still, what remains is not the glory of battle, but the echo of men who faced the storm and the lesson they left behind. In the end, war is not measured in victories or losses, but in what humanity dares to learn from the ashes. And somewhere out there beneath the calm Pacific sky, you can still hear it, the faint cooling sigh of metal, and the memory of those who forged a century out of blood and smoke. The story of Okinawa does not end with the silence of the guns. It lives on in the memory of what humanity created, destroyed, and learned in the process. The clash between two visions of war, the American pursuit of overwhelming force and the British belief in endurance, revealed more than the strength of nations. It revealed the soul of mankind under pressure. Both sides built miracles of steel and courage, but both discovered the same truth. Power without understanding leads only to ashes. The armored carriers of Britain proved that resilience can be as decisive as speed. They absorbed the fury of the kamikaze and kept fighting, turning survival itself into an act of defiance. The American carriers, with their vast air groups and wooden decks, proved that determination and industrial will could overwhelm any enemy, even when the cost was unbearable. Together, they shaped the next generation of warfare. Yet what they truly left behind was not a blueprint for stronger ships, but a lesson about the limits of human ambition. War had always been the stage where nations tested their ideas of strength. But Okinawa changed that stage forever. It showed that no matter how advanced the machine, it is still men who carry the weight of it, men who bleed, burn, and rebuild. Every innovation born from that battle, every layer of armor, and every safety system that came after, carries the memory of those who paid for it with their lives. We stand today in a world built upon those lessons. The oceans that once divided enemies now connect allies. The same nations that clashed in the Pacific now share knowledge, technology, and responsibility. But peace is not a gift. It is a choice that must be made every day. The sea still holds the same quiet power it did in 1945, waiting for humanity to decide whether it will be a bridge or a battlefield once more. The legacy of those who fought is not meant to glorify destruction, but to remind us of what endurance and compassion can achieve. Their courage should not only be remembered, it should be continued. Every act of understanding, every effort to build instead of destroy, honors their sacrifice more than any monument ever could. So let us look back on those burning decks, not with pride in war, but with gratitude for the lessons carved into its steel. Let us build a world where bravery serves peace, not annihilation. Because the true measure of progress is not how many weapons we can create, but how many wars we can prevent. History has already written its warning in the smoke above Okinawa. It is now up to us to answer it with wisdom, with restraint, and with the courage to be better than the fire that made us.